Hey gang. Well, it looks like the week is a wash, at least as far as being at school, and we've got another virtual day tomorrow. I'm sitting here with my puppies again. They are taking a little nap. They're going to listen to me yak. They have gotten very accustomed to watching their mom give speeches on this little phone thing. So anyway, I'm going to do my best to summarize chapter 13 of the AMSCO book. You were to have read chapter 13 for class today, or for the lesson today. I'm going to do a little bit of summary of it. I do have a couple of videos for you to watch. I've got a writing prompt for you to pick, and lots of long PowerPoint. So let's see here. I'm going to switch over to chapter 13, my PDF file. So essentially chapter 13 talks about the major political party problems that come into play as we approach the Civil War, legislation that's going to complicate things, individual people that are going to complicate things. We'll see that the only truly national party, the Democrat Party, is going to splinter into a regional party, effectively, with Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats, and then even a further breakup of Southern Democrats. We're going to see the rise of the Republican Party. There's also the Know Nothing Party that is discussed in this chapter, which is essentially nativists who are opposed to immigrants and prefer native-born Americans. The Free Soil Party, the Whig Party, is going to go away. It was short-lived. The name of this, or the title of this chapter, is "The Union in Peril," and it covers the period of 1848 to 1861. So essentially, after the Mexican-American War, all the way till the first shots of the Civil War. So you have about 13 year period of time where there's just lots and lots of controversy. My Southern friends would say that these issues were not 100% solely about slavery. My Northern friends would say pretty much every conflict revolved around the issue of slavery. But there were other things at play, regional differences that have to do with the economy, for instance, tariffs, the policy on not just slavery, but free Black Americans, should they be allowed to move into Western territories. The political party Free Soilers, their motto was free soil, free people, free land, or something like that. Some in the Free Soil Party were opposed to free Blacks moving into the territory, and they wanted to reserve that farmland for free white men, or for white men. There's also several presidents that are mentioned in this particular unit. It's kind of like a quick cascading effect. After President Polk leaves office, he actually passed away pretty soon after that. I think he was an alcoholic. But after President Polk left office, the very first Whig Party, political party president takes shape, and that is Zachary Taylor. Oh, wait a minute, hold on. I lied. Let me go back. So William Henry Harrison, who was elected to office following Martin Van Buren, was a Whig. When he passed away quickly, John Tyler was a Whig as well, although John Tyler was abandoned by the Whig Party because he wasn't Whiggish enough. And then James Polk comes to power, and he's a Democrat. So we have a Democrat kind of squeezed in between the two Whigs. So if you'll recall, he was known as Purposeful Polk. He wanted to seal the northern border of the United States, of the Oregon Territory. He wanted Texas. He wanted California. He got it all. Let's see here. After he left office, another Whig was elected to the office of presidency, and that was Mexican War General Zachary Taylor. There is a PowerPoint slide that shows you the various presidents. I'm going to make copies of them. They're like the ones I've already given you of each president, and you can look through that. He only served for about 18 months, and then Zachary Taylor suddenly died following a 4th of July celebration. It was very hot. He attended the celebration. He was wearing a wool suit. He came in to refresh himself and drank some milk and cherries, and a lot of milk and cherries apparently, and had some serious stomach issues. Some people think that there was something in the cherries that caused his system to go crazy. Apparently he already had some stomach issues, and he ended up dying, so very unexpectedly. And then his vice president was a squirrely guy by the name of Millard Fillmore. From what I've read about him, not crazy about the guy, but he was also a Whig Party member. And then the last couple of presidents before Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan, were also Democrats, but they were pretty weak Democrats. They didn't stand for much. They didn't do much to prevent the oncoming Civil War. They were just kind of the face of the party. They were chosen because they were kind of squishy. In fact, James Buchanan, who was the president right before Lincoln, he had been living abroad, didn't have much on the record to say about slavery, so he appeased the Southern Democrats. But anyway, so we have several weak presidents after President Polk, and then of course Abraham Lincoln. So the next slide that you're going to see is a slide of several pictures of people that have been very important to the issue of slavery leading up to this particular Civil War. There's a picture of John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, Stephen Douglas, Senator Charles Sumner, Harriet Beecher Stowe, John Brown, Harriet Tubman, and Dred Scott. And going to probably touch on most of these folks as we go through the lesson today. They were mentioned in the chapter. There is a writing prompt from the chapter, and you are welcome to, since you're at home on your own, you're welcome to use your book if you need to answer these questions. But I am going to let you pick whichever one you want, and you can pick whichever historical reasoning skill, whichever question you want, but make sure that you write it with the historical reasoning skill attached to it. I just want to say an extra special, or draw your attention to specifically contextualization. If you choose a question that says contextualization, it is your job in answering the question to set the stage, to explain the events leading up to that question. Hold on. Sorry, I got a phone call and a Google Classroom announcement at the same time. Okay, sorry. So you can do that, the writing prompt, anytime during the lesson. If you want to wait till the end of the lesson to write it and submit it, you can do that. And you're welcome to use your book, or you can, and probably I'm going to hit on some of this during my lecture. All right, the next slide is it's a map of the United States starting in 1789. And if you'll just sit on that slide for just a few seconds, you will notice that it is scrolling through the various stages of the country and which areas were free and which areas were slave. And at the very bottom corner, it keeps tally of which states were slave and which states were free. So I want you to watch that till it gets all the way to 1861 and kind of follow the progression of the states as they move across. Let's see here. All right. The first significant piece of legislation that's going to come into play, let me move this. There we go. Is the compromise. Sorry, y'all. People keep texting me. There you go. Is the Compromise of 1850. So California wants to come into the Union as a free state, which kind of surprised Southerners because a significant part of California lies below the 3630 parallel. And I think a lot of Southerners just anticipated California would petition to enter the Union as a slave state. And of course, Southern legislators were not going to allow California to enter the Union as a free state, because it would upset the balance in the Senate. And so in order to get California admitted, President Taylor was like, Zachary Taylor, he was like, well, if they want to be free, they can be free. He wanted to go ahead and allow them their petition to enter Congress, and he wanted to approve it. But Southern senators were not going to let that happen. And so through a series of negotiations that were largely concocted by Henry Clay, the great compromiser. He proposed 4 different aspects to a compromise that would appease Northern and Southern factions. And I'll list them. They're here on the slide. But the first one, of course, California would be entered into the Union as a free state. And in order to appease Southerners, he proposed that part of the Mexican cession, Utah and New Mexico territories, could choose for themselves whether or not they come into the Union as a free state or a slave state. And that idea was referred to as popular sovereignty, or sometimes called squatters sovereignty. A squatter is somebody who comes and settles the land. And so the idea was that they would defer the decision about slave or free to the people who lived in the territory. If the people who lived in the territory predominantly wanted it to become a slave state, then they should be able to vote to that effect. And if they wanted it to come into the Union as a free state, likewise. Now, that appealed to a few people in the North and a few people in the South. It greatly appealed to people in the South when that same idea of popular sovereignty is going to be applied to territories north of the 3630 line. Because if you will recall, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 prohibited any slave states north of that line. And if popular sovereignty were applied north of that line, that would open up a whole new set of territory potentially for slave states. Another part of the Compromise of 1850 was that Texas was going to essentially sell off part of its, like the long panhandle that was part of the original Texas territory, sell it back to the United States and divvy it out to various territories. And that part's kind of insignificant. I don't know that that would ever come up, but it's mentioned all of the time, so I'm throwing it out there. But the most controversial part of the Compromise of 1850 was a new and forceful fugitive slave law that would require those in northern free states to participate in the process of returning fugitive slaves from the north who had run away back to their owners in the South. And it gave all kinds of power to the federal government to provide support for Southerners who were trying to relocate their runaway slaves. Essentially, basically what it did was it said nowhere in the United States is it safe to be a runaway slave. At that point, a lot of runaway slaves actually started going into Canada, because by that point, the British Empire had outlawed slavery, and so Canada was actually a safe place for them to go. This infuriated Northerners, especially Northern abolitionists. If they were found to be hiding runaway slaves, they could be fined, they could be thrown in prison. And free blacks who lived in the North were not afforded any sort of judicial protection. They couldn't, if someone accused them of being a runaway slave and they were free, they had no right to a trial. They were just escorted back to the South and enslaved. So it was just a terrible, it was a hot mess, just put it that way. And so Henry Clay could not get this bill as a whole package across the finish line. And so Stephen Douglas, senator from Missouri, sweeps in. He's a Northern Democrat, and he says, how about we vote on each particular part of the bill separately? Because there are some senators and congressmen who like parts of it but not like the other parts of it. And perhaps if we kind of mix it up individually, it'll get across the finish line. And that's what they did. And so the Compromise of 1850 goes into effect in 1850, and this stirs up a hornet's nest. You'll see in the corner of this particular PowerPoint a picture of Zachary Taylor and a picture of Millard Fillmore, his vice president, who then becomes president upon Zachary Taylor's death. Zachary Taylor was in favor of just allowing California to enter the Union as a free state without all of the compromise. He died. His predecessor, Millard Fillmore, was all about the compromise, and he gave it the thumbs up and he signed it into law. Let's see here. I'm gonna zip down here a smidgen. Yeah, okay. All right, the next slide, there's several boxes here that have important legislation. Some of them are going to carry on down, but I'm just going to zip through each of them. So I already mentioned what the idea of popular sovereignty is. It was first introduced legislatively in the Compromise of 1850, but it becomes on full display in all of its ugliness in the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. So 4 years later, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, he was a Chicagoan, he wanted a railroad that was being debated on, a transcontinental railroad, to connect his city of Chicago with the far west, Oregon and California territory, California in particular. And in order for it to move through that expanse of those unsettled territories, the law stated that there had to be organized territories and basically law and order in order for the railroads to build through there. And so it became important to expedite the settling of that territory. And so Senator Douglas suggested that the territory be divided into Nebraska and Kansas territories, and that both of those territories, which were north of the 3630 parallel that prohibited slavery based upon the Missouri Compromise of 1820, that it be, hold on just a second. Come on out here, guys. I'm gonna let you out. Come on out. Sorry. My husband just got home and they're gonna start barking. So anyway, Senator Stephen Douglas suggested that those northern territories be open to the idea of popular sovereignty. And as a Northern Democrat, Southerners thought this was great because territory that was previously off limits to them was now available to them potentially. And so the Kansas-Nebraska Act nullified the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Franklin Pierce, who was now president, signed it into law. And so that now made the possibility of slave states available to slave interests as of 1854. So the big contest was going to be the territory of Kansas. Now, Stephen Douglas assumed that most of the farmers in the Kansas territory were actually anti-slavery. He did not perceive that the pro-slavery forces, especially people living in Missouri, would cross over the Missouri border into Kansas and set up kind of artificial homesteads and whatnot so that they could get voting rights, so that they could help pick a constitution that allowed for slavery in Kansas. And some people actually call Kansas the opening act of the Civil War because popular sovereignty and the idea that the people get to choose for free or slave was on full display in Kansas. And hundreds of people were killed as the competing forces entered the state. A couple of important issues related to Bleeding Kansas, as it came to be known, is that there were more anti-slavery forces in the Kansas territory. And there were a lot of pro-slavery forces that bled in there that were misrepresenting the total number of people who were pro-slavery. The pro-slavery folks were the quickest on their feet. They formed a constitution writing body. They created a constitution in Lecompton, Kansas, which became the pro-slavery Constitution of Kansas, and they quickly submitted it to Congress for approval. By this time, I'm trying to think. No, he wasn't president yet. Stephen Douglas actually blocked this constitution. He blocked the passage of this pro-slavery constitution in the Senate because he knew it to be not the actual representation of the people of Kansas. In response, pro-slavery forces attacked the anti-slavery town of Lawrence, Kansas, burned a bunch of buildings to the ground, created complete just chaos. And in response to that, a radical abolitionist by the name of John Brown, he and his sons decided to go to Kansas and take out or make retribution on some pro-slavery families living in the state. My recollection, the book doesn't mention this, but my recollection is his attack and his son's attacks on a specific family were pretty brutal. It was called the Potawatomi Massacre. It was along the Potawatomi Creek, and it was a family of farmers that had slaves. And in the middle of the night, he and his son snuck onto the farm, and they killed 5, I think, adults. I don't know if it was men and women or if it was just the men, but I think he cut off their hands and their feet. I remember reading that somewhere, and I don't know if he did that to make it look like an Indian attack. I'm not sure, but it was pretty bizarre. And so anyway, Kansas was just a complete utter mess. So Kansas statehood got put on hold as the Civil War approaches. Kansas doesn't become a free state. They actually do enter the Union as a free state, but they don't do so until after the Civil War starts. So Bleeding Kansas, opening act of the Civil War. I'll show you some pictures of that later, but already talked about the Know Nothing Party. And so another incident happened on full display. The tensions were on full display when Senator Charles Sumner, I think he was from Massachusetts, he gave a vitriolic speech on the floor of the Senate, accusing Southerners of just basically being horrible, immoral people. He specifically targeted a fellow senator from, I can't remember what southern state it was, but the senator's, don't remember if it was I think it was his cousin, Preston Brooks, who was a congressman, heard about the speech, walked across the Capitol, went into the Senate chambers as people were sitting around their desk talking, and he began to beat Charles Sumner with a cane. And people were just kind of shocked, but the guy got his brains just practically beat out of him. He never did fully recover from it, but after 2 or 3 years of rest and medical care, he does return to the United States Senate and help push through the 13th Amendment of the Constitution. So that the caning of Senator Charles Sumner, you may have read in chapter 13 that constituents of Preston Brooks sent him canes to replace the ones that he broke over Senator Sumner's head. All right, in the middle of all this, the Republican Party comes to be. The Republican Party was made up of Free Soil Party members who were more anti-slavery than they were anti-Black. Abraham Lincoln, for instance, had been a member of the Whig Party. He had been a member of the Free Soil Party. Abraham Lincoln was opposed to the spread of slavery into the free territories. He wasn't opposed to free black men moving into the territories. He was opposed to slavery moving into the free soil territories. And eventually the a number of issues the Republican Party coalesced around, specifically the stopping the spread of slavery into new territories. They supported an increased tariff to protect businesses, and they also supported legislation that would create a railroad through those new territories, through the central part of the country. Southerners have been blocking that transcontinental railroad legislation because it didn't go through the South, and they saw that as another mishap that would be problematic for them, that it would be unfair, that the money and commerce and everything would be happening in the North and via the railroads, and so they had been blocking that. And so that was the major platform of the Republican Party. They first introduced a presidential candidate in the 1856 election, John Fremont from California. He actually did pretty well. And then, of course, by the 1860 election, Abraham Lincoln is going to get elected president. Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a man who, he was a slave, and he was enslaved in Missouri. His owner took him to Wisconsin or Minnesota for a couple of years and then returned. And Dred Scott, his owner was dying or died, and he had been willed to another relative or something. And Dred Scott saw the opportunity to file suit for his freedom. And so in 1857, he filed suit for his freedom. It's made its way all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court had a number of slave-owning justices. Roger Taney was the Chief Justice and issued probably one of the worst Supreme Court rulings in American history, next to Roe v. Wade. And he basically said several points, but first of all, you, Dred Scott, as a slave, as a black man, have no right to challenge anybody legally in court. You have no right to do that. He said that the founding fathers did not perceive that black men would ever have the right to file suit in a court case, and so he didn't even have a right to do it, according to them. And then he said that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was unconstitutional, and that the Constitution protected the right of property owners. And so effectively, this decision, the Dred Scott decision, legalized slavery in every single state in the Union. It effectively said if you purchased your slaves legally, wherever, in Louisiana or Alabama or Georgia or Virginia or wherever, you can take them anywhere you want to. So if you are a plantation owner in South Carolina and you want to start a cotton plantation in Wyoming, go ahead and take your slaves up there. If you want to start one in Massachusetts, if you bought your slaves in the South, you can take your 200 slaves to Massachusetts. Of course, you can imagine, it freaked everybody out. And it, again, galvanized the abolitionist leaders and message in the North that slavery was immoral. Let's see here. Also, you'll also hear several times in the reading and on the PowerPoint, you'll see the word slave power. The Northerners were convinced that there was something called slave power that existed within the government. It would be kind of like how Trump was always talking about the swamp. Those people who were, lifetime government officials, like there's this swamp of people that make all the decisions and we have no say so. That was sort of the argument with slave power. There was a belief that there was a slave power that existed. It existed in the judicial branch of the Supreme Court. It existed in Congress, because how else does pro-slavery legislation keep getting passed when the northern states far outpopulate the southern states? It didn't make any sense. And then, of course, Democrat presidents who were pro-slavery kept getting elected president over and over again. So you'll see that expression about slave power. Prior to the 1860 presidential election, Abraham Lincoln, who had been a one-term congressman from Illinois, decided to run under the Republican Party for the United States Senate seat to replace Stephen Douglas. And so they had these debates called the Lincoln-Douglas debates, where he and Stephen Douglas met in 7 different venues across the state of Illinois. Stephen Douglas was very, very popular political figure, and this gave Abraham Lincoln a national audience because everybody was listening in, because Stephen Douglas was probably going to run for president. And so, of course, the main topic of debate was slavery. Stephen Douglas didn't have an answer to his conflicting views. Did he support the Dred Scott case, or did he support popular sovereignty? He didn't really have a good answer for that. But Abraham Lincoln was able to articulate his views on prohibiting the spread of slavery into the West. And he also very eloquently spoke about the immorality of slavery over and over and over again. So people got a really good sense of where he stood. Now, he lost that election. However, in the long term, it was a very good thing that he lost the election, because he would not have run for president 2 years later. So that's an instance where God allowed a loss to occur that would have probably felt like a really good thing at the time, but because he had something better planned for Abraham Lincoln. And just like Esther in the Bible, I truly believe that Abraham Lincoln was born for that moment in time, that he was the one God had chosen to unify our country. Let's see here. Almost done. All right, so John Brown and his sons and his followers decided to coordinate an attack on a federal arsenal in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. He believed that slaves in the area would join him, and they would have at their disposal one of the largest caches of weapons in the country. But to his, what's the word I'm looking for? To his surprise, nobody joined him. There were a couple, but really nothing happened. As word around the community of Harpers Ferry spread that there had been an attack on the federal arsenal, people rallied around it until the United States Marines showed up to take out John Brown and his handful of followers that had broken into the arsenal. I read in another source that all of his sons participated in the in Harpers Ferry assault, but the book doesn't mention that. But another source that I have says that all of his sons were killed in the assault. I don't know why the book didn't mention that, unless it's not, we don't know 100% for sure. But all of his followers were either killed or captured and hung, and eventually he also was hung. Northerners saw him as a martyr for the cause of abolition. Southerners saw him as a terrorist. So that happens just on the heels of the Civil War. When Abraham Lincoln is elected president in 1860, 7 southern states decide to secede from the Union. Let's see here. I don't have them listed here, but we'll get those later. It doesn't really matter. They included all of the South, the deep South: Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, Florida. I think I'm missing one. Did I say Mississippi? Those 7 states secede even before Abraham Lincoln becomes president. They formed the Confederate States of America in, I believe, February of 1861, and they elect Jefferson Davis to be the president of the Confederate States. This all happens before Abraham Lincoln even takes the oath of office. Abraham Lincoln didn't even appear, I don't think, on any of the southern state tickets. So the electoral, there were enough people in the North, population-wise, that Abraham Lincoln won the electoral vote without a single southern state voting for him. And so he had a mess on his hands when he became president. There is a picture here of the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln. You can see in the background that the U.S. Capitol dome that you guys had the privilege of seeing is not completed. And that is because the country had been growing so fast that the small dome that existed there prior was too small to accommodate. It looked weird with the growing House and Senate squares on either side. And so Congress had set aside funds to rebuild a larger dome. And that dome continued to be built during all through the Civil War, and it was completed by Abraham Lincoln's second inauguration. There was a lot of pressure on Abraham Lincoln to stop building the dome during the war and to defer those funds to the war effort, but he resisted, believing that that would appear to be symbolic that the Union would not survive, and he wanted to keep building the dome, and so he did. But I wanted you to see those pictures there of his first inauguration. The very last slide shows a picture of Fort Sumter in South Carolina. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next lesson leading up to the Civil War. The first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter by the Confederates. All right, I'm going to end it there. I'll upload this video and give you instructions in Google Classroom, and I hope you guys have a fantastic weekend and look forward to seeing you all on Monday.